Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you and contribute to the really important work that you're tasked with. My remarks are going to focus on the Great Migration from my perspective as an academic economist. I received my PhD from Northwestern University in economics. I've taught at UC Davis. In their econ department, I'm now at William & Mary. My research focuses on the relationships between education, health, and race, largely in the early 20th century, with multiple projects directly related to the Great Migration. I want to emphasize that my comments will focus squarely on the scholarship of economists regarding the Great Migration. The details I offer are an incomplete story without the contributions of sociologists, historians, political scientists, journalists, and importantly, the lived experiences of the individuals who took part in the Great Migration. These are all viewpoints I know the task force is gathering. The work I will highlight sheds light on very specific pieces of African American economic outcomes, but the way those pieces fit into a whole is a complex story beyond the scope of this testimony. The economics literature on the Great Migration has been steadily expanding, particularly in the last decade. This growth is due in part to newly available data sets, but also to a gradual, though certainly incomplete shift in the profession toward studying a more diverse set of experiences in the United States economic development. I want to emphasize that economists' knowledge of the Great Migration is certainly incomplete and steadily evolving. In my remaining time, I will outline the most recent attempts of economists to understand the economic forces driving the decisions of African Americans to migrate, the outcomes of those migrants in their new towns and cities, and the ways those cities evolved as a consequence of the inflows of migrants. While much of the decision to migrate out of the South was certainly related to the pervasive and institutionalized discrimination of Jim Crow, economic opportunity played a clear role in the timing and the geography of the Great Migration. The early waves of migrants were attracted north, in part by the increased demand for workers to meet the industrial production needs of World War I. Increasing employment opportunities in sectors such as manufacturing would continue to draw workers out of the South through the middle of the 20th century. The geographic distribution of these economic opportunities, in conjunction with the layout of the existing transportation networks, strongly influenced patterns of outmigration. This is clearly seen in the case of California, where migrants were drawn heavily from the states along the Southern Pacific Sunset Route. In 1950, over 40% of California's African-American population was born in either Texas or Louisiana. While transportation networks heavily influenced the initial connections between sending and receiving states, these connections were then reinforced by the social networks that provided information to family back home in the South and assistance navigating local labor and housing markets for subsequent waves of migrants. Ebbs and flows in the rate of migration through these networks was driven in part by fluctuations in economic conditions throughout the South. Downturns in the agricultural sector, most famously the devastation of the boll weevil, were particularly predictive of increased outmigration from different states. In the middle of the Great Migration, over 1/3 of African American males in the South were farmers or farm laborers. Contrast this with the occupational distribution for African Americans in California at the same time, in which only 5% remained in farming, with far more individuals working in the skilled trades and the service sector. It was not simply this change in job opportunities that led to brighter economic prospects outside of the South. Educational opportunities were better as well. Spending on public schools was higher outside of the South. In 1960, California's school expenditures per pupil were 27% higher than those in Texas, 14% higher than those in Louisiana, and almost 90% higher than those in Arkansas. These are the three states that contributed the most migrants to California during the Great Migration. The impacts of these differences in overall spending were compounded by underinvestment in Black schools relative to white schools and the segregated public school systems of the South. Clearly, the Great Migration led to a substantial increase in educational opportunities, something visible in far higher high school graduation rates for African Americans in the receiving states relative to the South. Returning to my earlier comparison, 85% of African American males born in California in the 1940s graduated high school. That figure is 76% for Texas, 68% for Louisiana, and only 67% for Arkansas. The move from labor markets and schools of the South to those of the North and West did indeed improve economic outcome. Average incomes for employed Black males in California were nearly double those in the South in 1950 and would still be 55% higher in 1970. Despite these large gains, though, from migration, the earnings gap between African American and white individuals remained large by the end of the Great Migration. There are a variety of reasons this was the case. First, the same economic opportunity that drew African Americans to the cities of the Northeast, Midwest, and West drew white Southerners as well. These white migrants similarly saw their educational and economic outcomes improve. Second, upon migration, African Americans still faced substantial discrimination in the labor market. Early waves of migrants often found that high-paying jobs were unavailable to them and faced low-paying, unskilled work and unemployment. Indeed, part of the delay in the initial migration of Black Southerners north was the preference among employers for hiring white European immigrants over African Americans. Job opportunities for African Americans remained very constrained until the flow of European immigration was severely restricted in the 1920s. As the decades progressed, discrimination would continue to depress the wages of African Americans relative to whites. Due to racial discrimination in hiring, additional arrivals of African American workers competed amongst each other for jobs, not necessarily against white workers. Consequently, additional arrivals of African Americans in northern cities had minimal impacts on white wages, but significant negative impacts on Black wages. Finally, the responses of local residents and governments to the Great Migration also contributed directly to the persistence of Black-white earning gaps. With the arrival of African Americans, white residents responded by moving to the suburbs and later the exurbs of cities. Estimates suggest that in northern cities, each Black arrival led to 2.7 white departures from the city. Through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, cities became increasingly segregated, with Black populations concentrated in city centers surrounded by largely white suburbs. Los Angeles provides a clear example. By 1970, despite an overall African American population share of 11%, the typical Black individual in Los Angeles lived in a census tract that was 72% African American. This choice to move to the suburbs was not necessarily available to Black residents. Racially restrictive housing covenants, discriminatory zoning ordinances, lending policies, including those of the Federal Housing Administration, and more informal forms of discrimination kept Black families from living in these neighborhoods and utilizing the amenities they provided, particularly well-funded public schools. As responses to the Great Migration led to segregation, Black households were faced with declining house values, de facto segregated schools, and decreased access to jobs and public goods. These factors have all contributed to lower rates of upward economic mobility in recent decades for those cities that had the largest inflows of Black residents during the Great Migration. These long-run economic consequences of the Great Migration are relevant to any discussion of reparations. The economic history of the Great Migration is one of an African American population going to great lengths to further their economic and social position. It's an example of precisely the type of individual initiative, industriousness, and perseverance that underpin those notions of an American dream. However, it reveals the formal and informal constraints that limited the economic opportunity available to African Americans despite that drive. In that respect, the Great Migration provides a cautionary note that regardless of the desire of reparations recipients to make lasting improvements to their lives and those of future generations, any success in doing so will be constrained by the persistence and the evolution of discrimination in schooling, housing markets, labor markets, and beyond. The case of the Great Migration highlights that reparations should be considered in conjunction with continued effort to eliminate discrimination in all of the various arenas that govern economic outcomes. Without doing this, they will likely disappoint their proponents and provide a straw man for their critics. Reparations alone cannot correct for centuries of economic disadvantage unless the structures that perpetuate that disadvantage as long as the structures that perpetuate that disadvantage well after emancipation continue to exist and to evolve. With that, those are the comments I prepared, and I look forward to any and all questions from the task force. Thank you very much.